Good evening, welcome. This afternoon we are joined by a special guest in our live session for the University of Francisco Marroquín's MOOC, Discover Don Quixote de la Mancha. This is Tim Hedberg. I'm Eric Graff, your host. This is Tim Hedberg, our special guest presenter. He will be interviewing me, asking the questions, probably asking some of his own, if I know Tim. Tim is a visiting professor at the university. He's teaching a film class. It's on film?
Yep, film production.
Film production at our new Escuela de Cine y Artes Visuales. We have a new school of film and the visual arts at the University of Francisco Marroquín. This is actually a studio that is part of that new school, so we are very excited about that. Please check it out. I don't know the web address, but you can Google Cine UFM and it'll show up. As usual, we are going to be taking questions from everyone who's participating. You can enter your questions in the window below on the YouTube site or to your right, our left, if you are using the webpage, the course webpage. This is Module 2, Tirante el Blanco. Please remember to go for certification. If you've come this far and you've done all that, it would be a shame to not take one actually quite fun and comical test and be certified. And always remember to tell your friends and anyone, family members, anyone you think that might be interested in this course. We offer it in English and Spanish. And we have, by the way, finished all our filming and are now editing and about to upload Module 3. So we now have all of the 1605 novel by Cervantes, Don Quixote de la Mancha. And we're very proud of that. So this is kind of a climactic moment, and I think it's very appropriate that Tim be with us. So please start asking questions and or feel free to make comments.
Well, before that, let me introduce you, for those who don't already know. Eric Clifford Graff is a professor of literature at the Universidad Francisco Marroquín. He has a PhD in Spanish language and literature from the University of Virginia. He specialized in medieval and early modern Spain, the history of the novel, Renaissance studies, and literary, political, cultural, and economic theory. In addition to numerous academic essays on poetry, on the poetry, theater, and narrative of Miguel de Cervantes, he has also published the book Cervantes and Modernity. Wow, quite a lot.
Too much.
Not enough. Well, congrats. And I have a question here already for you to get started and kick it off. Our first question is from Tom ABQ, and he asks, what are the chivalric virtues being pursued by knight-errant Don Quixote?
Wow. What are the chivalric virtues? I'm sure there's a list somewhere. That doesn't immediately come into my head, though. He clearly represents valor, strength. He's always talking about the strength of his arm. He says, "Yo valgo por cien." I'm equivalent to 100 knights. He also represents extreme respect for women. He's very adamant about women should be treated with special care and respected. There's certain rules of engagement. He's clearly seeking adventure. I don't think that's a virtue necessarily, but it's what he's after. That's a good question. What virtues is he seeking to represent? He vacillates. I think that question is important because at the end of the day, we see that there's a crisis. He's taking some virtues from some books and other virtues from other books, and they're often in conflict. For example, he wants to be, we'll just take a simple example, the greatest chivalric novel of the 16th century was the Amadís de Gaula. And Don Quixote is probably the most ideal character that he constantly alludes to. and wants to imitate and model himself after. In fact, he gives several discourses, harangues, disquisitions on how Amadis is the greatest of all knights. And one of the things that distinguishes Amadis is that he's insanely loyal and faithful, right? He never betrays his beloved. But at the same time, on a number of occasions, Don Quixote quotes from a romance, a ballad about Lancelot. And Lancelot is actually famous for being rather sexually adventurous. So you have this conflict where some of his models, the virtue of fidelity, conflicts with this sort of virile Ovidian sexuality that you get in a Lancelot character. So
yeah, that's interesting.
He's a mess.
Yeah, in many ways, when I hear the word chivalry modernly, used today, it kind of connotes this respect for women in general, right? So the chivalric duties. It's an interesting way of putting it, because I imagine that it would be like unpacking in what ways does he appreciate or have utmost respect for women in the novel. And that being what I understand to be an exception to a lot of the state of that time period. Is that right? Or
no, I think that's right. I think that is a certain aspect and probably the predominant aspect of chivalric novels. But it's not all of them, and there are exceptions, and there are knightly heroes who don't fit the bill. So it's complicated.
All right, very awesome. Well, one question down. We have another one coming right in here.
Excellent.
This is question 2 from Ariel Lindgreen from Strasbourg, France. Awesome.
Wow.
And Ariel wants to know, what do you think about the influence of Don Quixote on 20th century humor? Wow. Laurel and Hardy, the Marx Brothers, Groucho, Harpo, Chico.
Wow.
Yeah, what a question.
That's a great question, especially the Laurel and Hardy. The fat man and the thin man, I think they're called in Spanish. That sort of Mutt and Jeff routine, or you could even raise it up a notch. Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis, the kind of pair of comedians that really comes into its own in the vaudeville tradition, and we still see it today, I think, quite a bit. There's so many, comic adventure stories where it's two guys in a car.
And having so much visual imagery
as you say that. And one's stuff. Another good example would be like Toy Story, where you have Buzz Lightyear, who's just this fantasy character who wants to go to space, Buzz Lightyear and beyond. Very Quixote.
Or what about like an Abbott and Costello? Is that within the same world?
Yeah, I think so. Somebody is always grounded, and somebody is always just a lunatic and a little bit off his rocker. But they switch, right? I mean, in part 1, they're one way, and in part 2, they actually switch places. Sancho becomes more fantastical and emphasizing these diluted interpretations of reality, and Don Quixote starts to see things as they are and is skeptical. In part 1, Sancho's the skeptic. Don Quixote is this crazy, dreaming character.
So do you think that a lot of these characters that we're talking about in more modern humor are actually derived from the novel?
Well, the reason I went to Toy Story is I think there you can see Woody is, come on, please, you can't fly. And Buzz Lightyear is clearly a quixotic character, I would say. In that case, you've got some graduate students writing some scripts for Hollywood that I would wager is influenced by Don Quixote. In the other cases, I don't know, how much of this is the actual influence of Don Quixote, or is this the way we learn humor? Or is this something that goes back into even a more medieval tradition?
Right, does it precede Don Quixote, this novel itself?
Well, I mean, on a serious level, Dante and Virgil are a pair who go through the universe together. One is guiding the other. Their dialogue. The whole notion of a humanist dialogue requires two participants, and somebody's going to be naive and somebody's going to be sharp, and they're going to reverse positions. But the humor part's interesting. I don't know. I never know what extent to say Don Quixote actually influences and causes, but you can certainly see parallels, and maybe we're talking about just humor generally as a phenomenon.
Right, there might be something more about humor itself that's most represented
and what you see in Don Quixote is some of the really early inklings of modern humor. For example, the accumulative technique that you see in Family Guy, where the character's making a joke, he makes it again and again and again, and again, and again. And you're laughing, and then there's a phase there where you're like, okay, all right, it's too much. And he does it again and again. And then you come back around, and he's done it so many times that it becomes funny again. That is very quixotic. Cervantes does that all the time. Don Quixote goes off on a long list of speech, and halfway through it, you're, oh, this is absurd. There's so many adjectives he's throwing here to describe her, and it becomes ridiculous at some point, and you find yourself laughing again at the end of the list.
It almost sounds like Cervantes might have made a discovery rather than like authored a new way of doing humor, right? Like found out something truthful about human nature and what we react to that causes us to laugh, and others took that lead and further built on it.
Sure, I like that. But I also like the idea of this notion of laughing at yourself, this kind of modern American Jewish humor tradition. Yeah. There's something, I mean, I don't find it risky to contemplate the notion that Cervantes, as a critic of the Spanish imperial experiment and the expansion, and as a critic of the Inquisition, and as somebody who very likely was of converted Jewish descent, there's something very specific about his modern humor that relates to the Jewish humor of the 20th century.
Yeah, wow. Awesome question. I'm really glad that one came in. Question. If anyone else has questions, get them in now. I have another one that just came in, so I want to move on, if that's okay to the next one.
All right.
We have Dwight from Morgan Hill, California, asking, can you explain more about the galley slaves, specifically about, I'm probably not going to say this right, Gines de Pasamonte?
Gines de Pasamonte.
Gines de Pasamonte, okay.
Can I explain more about the galley slaves?
Yeah.
Gines de Pasamonte is a very important figure. He's one of the few figures that appears again in part 2. So we know he's important because Cervantes comes back to him. He's also very important because he signals the genre that Cervantes is using in Don Quixote. And this is where I get into it with some of my colleagues. But I'm convinced that the best way to understand what is going on in Don Quixote is to read the picaresque, the history of the picaresque, the Golden Ass in particular, and the Lazarillo de Tormes. And the Lazarillo de Tormes, Gines de Pasamonte cites in this chapter, in chapter 22, I believe it is. It's in the 20s. He says, I'm writing my autobiography, and mal año para Lazarillo de Tormes. Bad news for this particular novel and all of those who would imitate the picaresque. And what I find fascinating about this, and I'm sorry, what was his name?
This is Dwight.
Dwight, this is my own little academic madness, but what I find interesting about Gines de Pasamonte is the way he puts that genre on the table in front of us, signals it, and is basically telling us there was a competition in the early 17th century to perfect the picaresque novel, and that's what Cervantes himself is doing. That's what makes that scene really interesting to me. Apart from that, there's all kinds of stuff there about justice, and are these men really guilty, and there's gradations of guilt, and Gines de Pasamonte seems like the worst of them all. Here he is in his, nope, there he is, full chains. He's the one that everyone's scared of. The guards are afraid of him. He's totally locked down. He's like a Hannibal Lecter character somehow. But then he appears in part 2, and he's actually a pretty decent guy. He's reasonable. He's an entrepreneur. He has a little puppet show. So he's a very, very enigmatic central character, and Cervantes in many ways does build his novel around him.
And you know what? Dwight just asked a follow-up question just now. And this is interesting. So he says, since Tim's focus of study is film, maybe Eric and Tim can discuss problems with adapting DQ to film. Terry Gilliam, for example. Are there and are there good non-English adaptations? You know, and it's worth mentioning that we're planning on doing another shoot in a couple of weeks with you, kind of going in a more YouTube fashion, perhaps discussing some of these themes. But I wonder what your take is on that. And
no, I don't think anyone's made a successful film version of Don Quixote. It's just too. It's so large that I think people get overwhelmed by it. It's 1,300. I mean, look at this thing. Look at that. You can't. This would be the equivalent of all of Shakespeare's tragedies and half of his history plays. How could you do a film, when you can do one film about Romeo and Juliet, how could you do a film about all of that?
Sounds like you're issuing a challenge here to filmmakers anywhere and everywhere to try this.
And I think that the modern way TV and episodic shows are going, the way these like Mad Men or
Breaking Bad,
which are 18 episodes, 10 episodes, and stop, or 15. That's ideal. That's what this is. This is an episodic series of case studies, cases, events, and it's ideal for that. It's just screaming for somebody to do it. Terry Gilliam gets, I think, just bogged down in his own epic grandeur. He actually made a film about trying to make a film about Don Quixote.
Oh, I didn't know that. What's it called? Do you remember? It's like, okay.
It's like the time I tried to make Don Quixote or something. It's really like explicit. And Johnny Depp's in it, and somebody else. Something happened, like the guy he had picked to be Don Quixote died. So and it just all went downhill. And yet he turned it into a film. I think he has a particular film about a knight. It stars Robin Williams, where he's seeing this red knight. I can't remember the exact name of that film, but that's very quixotic. Gilliam's clearly obsessed with Don Quixote. He says he has a film on its way. I'm dying to see it.
On Don Quixote?
Yeah, he says he's working on one right now. I would say the best film version of Don Quixote that I've seen is Monty Python and the Holy Grail. It just is. It just works. It's what it's doing. It's medieval.
What about this? Do you see any other themes in Terry Gilliam's work from some of his more successful work that you can see Don Quixote's influence on, or is that not not evident?
The whole, I think, I can't go through all of Gilliam's films here, but this one with Robin Williams, which name I have chosen to forget, evidently. The Monty Python has this conflict between medieval idiots and the modern world. It mocks these knights errant. It's clearly quixotic in its inception and in its structure and in its type of humor. And then I would say something like Brazil, where you have a sort of a conflict of, almost like a Randian conflict of visions of reality, where somebody wants to live and create their own dreamscape, and this oppressive dystopian world is oppressing the hero. That's very quixotic in its basic structure, because that's what Don Quixote is. He wants to live in this late 15th century, early 16th century chivalric romance, and he wants to see the world in that way, but the world won't let him. The material world is constantly intruding on that fantasy. So I think Gilliam's probably one of the most quixotic filmmakers ever, and he's certainly given it another shot as we speak.
That's awesome. I didn't even know about that. I'm pretty excited now to I'm going to look this up.
I secretly hope he fails again. I love Terry Gilliam, nothing personal. I just, I feel like I should be the advisor on his set.
We can try to make that happen. All right, awesome. Well,
great question, by the way.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. And keep them coming. So another question is from Bellavita. Isn't it difficult to understand the depths of Cervantes' Don Quixote Cervantes' Don Quixote without first researching the judicial, economic, and moral laws of the time? I mean, only Don Quixote is able to remain constantly moral, while the world around him is constantly immoral. Indeed, the fact that the knight-errant must be thought delusional to possess such morality sheds more light on Cervantes' outer world than on Quixote himself. The Don must be mad in order to remain true to the chivalrous principles. The topic is so complex and multifaceted, but fun. Yeah,
it is. That's a really complicated question.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I followed all of it, but I would recommend Susan Barron's book on law, and I don't know if it's Law and Cervantes' Don Quixote or Law and Don Quixote, but she formulates and frames the question much in the way that, I'm sorry,
Bellavita?
Bellavita just did. That's terrific. Don Quixote is living, or trying to live, according to some very simple values. We've already talked about how sometimes those are already in conflict. Sometimes his exemplary models don't match up. That's one problem. But even if we were to grant him his simple vision of justice and war as seeking peace and imposing this chivalric egalitarianism, right? That a knight can rise to become an emperor because right? Just because the king's daughter falls in love with him, right? So he's constantly advancing this very, we would consider it a very modern, I think, view. Although at that point in time, I think it's like nostalgic. It's weird. It's coming out of these medieval texts, and yet late 16th century, early 17th century Spain is highly stratified. It's almost a caste society. The laws are in a total chaotic flux. There's Fuero tradition. There's Alfonso X. There's
so you're saying that
Habsburg.
yes. You're saying yes. You
That's
have
what
to
she's spot
understand
on.
all of these things. And I wonder. That makes me wonder. Going back to that previous question, is that part of the issue? And actually, Dwight's helping us out here by telling us that the name of the movie is The Fisher King.
The Fisher King. Exactly. That's it. Yes.
So, but that makes me wonder, right? Is that part of what is so
Thank you,
difficult?
Dwight.
And in my conversations with you, we talked a couple months back, and as somebody who doesn't know too much about Don Quixote, what really fascinated me was being able to sit down over dinner with you and just like dive into all of these complex realities that he was discussing.
Right.
And that's when I'm like, wow, I really need to understand this.
Yeah,
I'm missing out. So I'm wondering if that might be why it's so hard to put it into a cinematic movie form.
No, I don't think so.
No?
I
Okay.
think the cinema can work. I think it can be done. I think the modern sort of series type productions that you're seeing from companies like Amazon or HBO is perfect for it. I think that's doable. I think, maybe somebody's having trouble finding the right advisors, or maybe people have their own reading. Terry Gilliam seems to emphasize this very romantic artist struggling against the world, almost Dream the Impossible Dream version of it, fetishizing madness as the true artist's persona. And I think there's a lot of other really interesting stuff going on. So, I would say that if you don't take some of those things that Bellavita just mentioned into account, then maybe you're not getting at what makes Don Quixote so funny and so fascinating to read.
Yeah. Awesome, awesome. Well, here I have a question from Maggie, and this is our very first image-based question. So
Maggie.
I'm going to hold up this image for the camera, and I'm going to ask the question. This image here features the cliff where Dorotea pushed her employer. Yeah, pushed her employer, the shepherd and the potential rapist over the cliff. The man on the left is similar to the Don Quixote with his pants down, doing penance, except that he is not standing on his head. The other figure probably represents the shepherd, also with his pants down, ready to rape Dorita. Is that how you say it?
Dorotea.
Dorotea.
I see.
She, however, is not represented in the image. Had she gone away after thinking she had killed him, and then he climbed back up the cliff to find a man similarly attired, but as a penance? Are the skulls below the cliff the remnants of other rejected men, or are they the skulls of women killed by their rapists? This image does have more questions than answers for me.
Of course it does. Okay, this is not fair, but
Here, I can hold this.
I know the artist, so
So you have some
I
inside
do
info
know
here.
I do know a few things about the drawing and what's going on here. This is actually Dorotea, and this is the shepherd who was attempting to rape her. So what was being represented here is Dorotea pushing the rapist off a cliff.
Okay.
I assume these skulls allude to death, and maybe it universalizes the event. Maybe it says that humanity has a long history of violent acts. I'm not sure how far I can go with interpreting the specific details. This is a drawing done by my friend Chris Roloffs in Keene, Virginia, and he picks specific episodes. I usually give him a set to select from, and he takes the ones that he finds most interesting. He really liked this idea of Dorotea as using her sexuality to position the rapist such that she could kill him.
A trap.
Yeah, a trap. A good one that he deserved.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, a lot to unpack there. I like this question a lot, though, because there's a lot of thought going into what exactly is going on there and really some interesting interpretations.
Right. Sometimes it's hard to tell.
Yeah. All right, so we have here another question from Lisa T. from Module 1, Week 1, and there's another
Okay.
image for this question.
Okay.
That's our next image right here. Now, this question, it says, the reference to medicine could represent the barber, doctors of the time, and the church to the priest, with the windmill representing DQ. I'm thinking that instead of it being Aristotle, it is our narrator, DQ, is trying to talk to. The cracks in the wall reflect the construct of reality collapsing, or perhaps DQ's reality is collapsing. I'm interested in your insights about the painting on the right. The knight, DQ, is facing a lion, unafraid. What is the lion representing? Is this another reference to the church? And when Daniel was in the lion's den?
Ooh.
What interpretation do you bring to the image of the two men at the table?
Right. Okay. I mean, I like the idea of she said it was Aristotle and then said it's also the narrator. I think that makes sense.
I'm thinking of it, yeah.
He does have a pen in his hand. He is writing. There are texts open here. I think the idea was that Aristotle here is also counting money. This might be some sort of accounting ledger. And one aspect of Don Quixote's madness that we've tried to emphasize is that he is economically unfit for the modern world. He does not understand money. He doesn't know he needs to take money with him on his adventures. He's living in this pre-economic fantasy world. And there's a phrase in chapter 1 where the narrator basically says, even Aristotle could not have helped him out if he had been resuscitated for that purpose alone. So that's how mad Don Quixote is. The reference to medicine, I don't know what you're referring to unless you're referring maybe to this staff here that might look like I guess that's a medical symbol there with the two-headed snakes at the top. These are actually supposed to be dragons, according to Chris. But he didn't have to do two. He didn't have to do them in that way, and he certainly did represent them in a way that looks like medicine. And medicine is a huge theme in the novel. In fact, that goes all the way back to Plato, where political philosophy is analogous to medicine, right? We're curing society's ills by creating intelligent leaders. This lion up here, I think that was a reference to the Cid, who actually tames a lion at some point in the poem of the Cid. But there's also an episode in Don Quixote where he confronts lions. So there is something self-reflexive there. And of course, the University of Francisco Marroquín has a lion on its crest. So there's all kinds of subliminal stuff going. Yes, there's a lion. So there's all kinds of. Chris likes to create puzzles. So even if you're off, you're doing what he would want you to do with his art, and he certainly is hiding things and creating interpretive problems when he draws.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by the insight of these questions. It's really drawing out a lot from these images.
Yeah,
Props to the artist for being able to invoke that kind of...
I think that's great. That's what it takes to, I think, read and enjoy Don Quixote at its fullest. You have to be an aggressive reader. You have to be willing to stop and ask questions. What is that doing there? Right. Exactly.
Awesome. Well, it's a good thing we have a guide such as yourself to help us get through some of those. So Dwight's weighing in here again with some comments, some opinions that I think we're going to get your reaction to. Dwight has told us, it says here that he's reading Mark Van Doren's lectures in the book Don Quixote's Profession. And he says he's really enjoying it, even though he's not buying into his insistence that Don Quixote wasn't mad, but was merely having fun imitating the chivalric ideals. But he likes Van Doren's comment about one irony of the novel, that Cervantes saved chivalric literature by satirizing it.
Interesting. Wow. I haven't read Van Doren's book, I have to confess.
Okay.
So I appreciate the insight and the question and the observation. That does sound very interesting. I would agree with you. I do think there are moments where Don Quixote is clearly out of his gourd. But I suppose one could interpret him as an extension of Cervantes and in some way designed to engage other characters more than simply be a study in one man's insanity. In other words, there's something about his insanity that leads to questions about how other characters react to his insanity, and that's almost more interesting than the insanity itself, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
It's a ruse. It's an excuse to write the novel. So in that sense, maybe we could make a generous reading interpretation of Van Doren's book. And then what was the last part he said that he's
that he likes Van Doren's comment about the irony of the novel that Cervantes saved chivalric literature by satirizing. He added another comment here where he said, by the way, I just saw the movie Quiz Show recently, and Mark Van Doren is seen in the classroom explaining the point of Don Quixote as, if you want to be a knight, which seems to fit very well with the speeches in Van Doren's book.
Wow, interesting. Well, I clearly have another book that I have to put on my list. I like this notion of, what was it, that Don Quixote is saving, or Cervantes is saving chivalry by mocking it.
Yeah, satirizing
That accords with, I think, Maria Vargas Llosa's interpretation of the novel as a way, the real way that Don Quixote anticipates classical liberalism is that it salvages these ideals from chivalric fiction precisely at a time when nobody's buying chivalric fiction anymore. In fact, the moral case against chivalric fiction is an early 16th century phenomenon that occurred in the 1520s. So the notion that in 1605 he has to write a novel in order to convince people that chivalric fiction is too lascivious and too violent, that's already been done. That was done 100 years ago, so it's an excuse. So what Vargas Llosa says is that he sees in these novels a set of values and individual virtues that vindicate the individual against a tyrannical, increasingly authoritarian, centralized state. And so we're seeing a pre-liberal reaction to a phenomenon that later the liberals would in reality be reacting against, right? He's anticipating that authoritarian state, the French imperial je suis l'état, right, of the 17th and 18th centuries, much later. But he's already angry at the state. And he uses those chivalric novels to pull out values, pull out heroism, and give individuals something to identify with against this tyrannical monster. So
that's
I don't know if that accords with what he was saying there, but
yeah. Well, when you get to that book, you can
when I get to that book,
comment on that and see if that's right. So here we have another question, and this is Cardenio a savage or a confused and angry young man?
Right.
Was he always this way? We find out in chapter 23 and 24 that he was engaged, but left her to become a friend of the young courtier Fernando. We might think that this could be a good opportunity to learn social graces, but Fernando is really a cad and not a very good role model for a husband. Cardenio's previous behavior seems to have come undone by his false friendship, and he disposes of good clothes and money with a gentleman, which a gentleman would be indispensable in polite society.
I'm not sure I understood the last comment about him disposing of his clothes, but maybe that's the part where he leaves town in disgust. I think after witnessing this wedding between his beloved Lustinda and Don Fernando. So is Cardenio mad, or is Cardenio just a confused young man, or what? I can't remember the exact parameters of the question, but
confused and angry.
Confused and angry. I think we're clearly talking about late adolescence at best. He's got an ambivalent relationship with his own father. He seems to arrange the marriage to Lustinda, but then he decides not to confront his father about it. He's afraid of his father's reaction. So there might be some caste issue as well. There might be something about Lustinda's origins. Perhaps she's of Jewish descent. Perhaps she's just too much of a peasant. Perhaps she's a new Christian, which would be of Jewish descent. Or Morisca, who knows? But maybe Cardenio thinks that his father will disapprove. But whatever the case is, there's a problem, and he doesn't ask his father to get married. And then he leaves Lucinda in the lurch and seems to enjoy this life at the Duke's court. I think you're asking exactly the right questions. What are the motives of Cardenio that Cervantes is subtly putting on display? And he's definitely a problem. He's definitely overly aggressive. He's lost his mind when we first meet him. He attacks Don Quixote for some little comment, for interrupting him, actually. So he's borderline psychotic, actually. I think a Freudian diagnosis would be that he is psychotic because his neurosis actually results in harm to himself and others. But I think that madness and that psychosis, again, it's fiction, so Cervantes is using those to represent something else. He's telling us something about maturity, something about respect for women, something about male sexuality.
Awesome. Yeah, so we're getting kind of low on time here, so I want to get to one more here at least, which is an opinion asking for your reaction to that opinion. Okay. So this is coming from Rafael from Manchester, UK. Wow. He says one of the interesting legacies of DQ in literary tradition is the way in which it has been used, alluded to, whenever a certain genre or style came into crisis. For example, in Brazilian Romanticism, DQ becomes part of the critical arsenal of poets who were tired of the formulaic romantic topics, lexic, etc., and wanted something new and different. Would the professor agree that that's what DQ came to represent in modernity, a symbol of dissatisfaction, crisis, even revolution?
Wow. Yes. The short answer is yes. Because Don Quixote itself is such a crazy generic experiment, and there's so many different genres involved. There's Byzantine novel, there's Morisca novel, there's detective fiction here, early hints at detective fiction. There's some sort of moral, almost Jesuit, moral exemplary tale stuff going on in here. There's epic, there's chivalric fiction, of course, being mocked. All of this, there's folk stories, all of this generic hybridity creates this amorphous and very violent and destructive form of art, because everything that comes after it is going to be subjected to it, it's going to consume it. This is actually Bakhtin's vision of what a novel is. He defines a novel negatively. He says the novel is everything that's not epic. And because it becomes all genres, it adapts itself to all other genres, it's unstoppable. It becomes this modern event that we can't escape from. And I could certainly see romantics and 20th century Marxists in particular very attracted to Don Quixote for its revolutionary, not just because it's aesthetically revolutionary, but because it seems to be an anti-authoritarian text. So I think that's spot on. I didn't follow some of the subtleties of the parallels with Brazilian literature in particular, but I think the general gist of your take is accurate.
Awesome, awesome. So we have this next image here, and so this says. Well, so we're going to give you
Chapter
60
4.
seconds to answer this one because we got to conclude pretty quickly here. The question is, why did he start a fight with so many men? Why did he switch from being honorable to being righteous? And above all, why did he blame poor old Rocinante? What might be its significance?
Why did he take on these men? Short
60
answer
seconds.
is Don Quixote is not a hero. But at this point, we're starting to investigate in what ways Don Quixote is a problem. You'll notice that he attacks merchants. These merchants are simply attempting to trade between Toledo and Murcia. They're associated with the silk trade, which is associated with the novel itself. Don Quixote here is revealed as someone who is a problem to modern economic bourgeois existence.
Awesome.
So there you go. That's
Awesome.
the short answer. Why does he blame Rocinante? Because he has to blame somebody. It can't be his fault.
Thank you, Eric. Wow, this is so much fun. Thank you all for the questions. I feel so much more.
That went by so fast.
Yeah, I'm way more
Terrific.
excited to dive deeper into this novel when I get a chance. This is really awesome.
Thank you,
Eric.
Tim.
Yeah,
thank everyone for joining us. And please remember to go for certification. That's all laid out in great detail on our website. And please encourage people to subscribe at donquixote.ufm.edu. And we'll see you next time. and keep reading. It's time to start part 2, actually.